As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood, Detective Emily Foster stood at the edge of a meticulously landscaped garden. The scent of blooming roses lingered in the air, an eerie contrast to the gruesome scene before her. She had seen her fair share of crime scenes in her years on the force, but this one was different. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she took in the sight of the lifeless body that lay sprawled on the lush green lawn. Emily's partner, Detective James Mitchell, leaned in closer to examine the victim. "Looks like another one, Em," he muttered, his breath forming a small cloud in the crisp evening air. "Same MO, strangled and left out in the open like a trophy." Emily nodded grimly, her hazel eyes narrowing as she surveyed the surroundings. They had been chasing the serial killer responsible for these gruesome murders for months, and the trail had grown colder with each passing day. The media had dubbed the killer the Garden Strangler due to the disturbing way the bodies were displayed. "Any witnesses?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James shook his head. "Not a soul. It's like the killer knew exactly when to strike and vanish without a trace." The two detectives knew they were dealing with a cunning and elusive predator. The fact that the murders had all taken place in seemingly idyllic neighborhoods only added to the mystique of the case. Emily knelt beside the victim and carefully studied her. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, her once vibrant red hair now matted with blood. Her lifeless green eyes stared up at the darkening sky, frozen in a silent scream. Emily couldn't help but wonder what had led this woman to such a horrific end. "We need to talk to the neighbors," Emily said, rising to her feet. "Someone must have seen or heard something." Their investigation led them to a modest 2-story house next door. Emily knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the wood with a sense of urgency. After a few moments, the door swung open, revealing a middle-aged woman with worried eyes. "I'm Detective Foster, and this is Detective Mitchell," Emily began, flashing her badge. "We need to ask you some questions about your neighbor." The woman's face paled, and she stepped aside to allow the detectives to enter. She introduced herself as Mrs. Turner and led them into her cozy living room. Emily couldn't help but notice the framed family photos on the mantelpiece, a stark contrast to the horror they had just witnessed. "What can you tell us about your neighbor, Mrs. Turner?" James inquired gently. Mrs. Turner hesitated, her gaze shifting nervously. "She's a quiet woman, keeps to herself mostly. I think her name is Sarah, but we've never really spoken. She moved in about 6 months ago." Emily exchanged a glance with James. "Did you notice anything unusual tonight? Any strange noises or people lurking around?" Mrs. Turner bit her lip, clearly torn between divulging information and protecting her privacy. "Well, now that you mention it, I did hear some strange noises a little while ago, like someone moving around in her backyard. I thought it might be raccoons or something, so I didn't pay much attention." Emily's heart raced. It was a lead, a glimmer of hope in a case that had seemed impossibly bleak. She thanked Mrs. Turner for her cooperation and handed her a business card with their contact information before they left. Back in the garden, the forensic team had arrived to process the crime scene. Emily's mind raced as she contemplated the possibility that the killer had been hiding in plain sight, living right next door to his victims. As they walked back to their car, James couldn't hide his concern. What if this is the breakthrough we've been waiting for? What if Sarah is the killer?" Emily sighed, the weight of the case pressing down on her shoulders. "We can't jump to conclusions, James, but we need to find out who she is and what she's been up to. Get a warrant to search her house, and let's hope we find something that ties her to these murders." The hours passed slowly as they waited for the warrant to be approved. Each minute felt like an eternity, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. Emily knew that if they didn't find anything in Sarah's house, they might lose their only lead. Finally, armed with the warrant, they approached Sarah's house. The lights were off, and the curtains were drawn, casting an eerie shadow over the structure. Emily's heart raced as she thought about what they might uncover inside. They entered cautiously, guns drawn, sweeping each room meticulously. The house was immaculate, almost obsessively so. Nothing seemed out of place, until they reached the basement. The air grew colder as they descended the narrow staircase, and Emily's flashlight revealed a chilling sight. The basement was filled with an array of gardening tools, neatly organized on a wooden workbench, but it was what hung on the walls that sent a shiver down her spine. Rows upon rows of photographs, each one a portrait of one of the victims. "This is it, Em," James whispered, his voice trembling. "We found his hideout." The stakes had been raised, and the tension in the room was palpable. They had finally cornered the Garden Strangler, but now they had to catch him before he slipped through their fingers once more. The race against time had never been more critical, and the shadows of the past loomed large over the detectives as they prepared to confront the monster in their midst. Part 2. The basement was a chilling chamber of horrors, adorned with grim trophies of the Garden Strangler's malevolent handiwork. Emily and James felt their breath catch in their throats as they gazed upon the rows of photographs, each face a haunting reminder of lives cut short. The relentless wind outside seemed to echo their growing unease, rattling the basement windows like a mournful choir. "We need to secure this place and call for backup," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. She knew that capturing the Garden Strangler was the culmination of months of tireless effort and sleepless nights, but it was also the most perilous moment of their careers. James nodded, his eyes never leaving the photographs. "You're right, Em. We can't let him slip away again." As they retreated from the basement, Emily could feel the weight of the case bearing down on her. The Garden Strangler had turned their lives into a relentless pursuit, an obsession, but this time, they had an advantage. They were inside his lair. Their knowledge of his hideout gave them the upper hand. Back at the precinct, Emily and James organized a task force to converge on Sarah's house. News of the discovery had spread like wildfire among the officers, and the excitement was palpable. This was the break they had all been waiting for, and it was time to bring the Garden Strangler to justice. Emily's phone rang, and she saw the call was from Mrs. Turner, the neighbor. She answered quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Detective Foster, I just remembered something." Mrs. Turner's voice quivered with nervous energy. "A few weeks ago, I saw Sarah digging in her backyard late at night. It was strange, and she looked so focused. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that I've heard about those photographs..." Emily's pulse quickened. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. You've been incredibly helpful. Please stay safe and keep your doors locked. We're on our way back to Sarah's house right now." The race against time resumed as they returned to the house. The task force had surrounded the property, and they proceeded cautiously, guns drawn. It was clear that Sarah knew they were onto her. The once dark house now had a dim light coming from an upstairs window. As they reached the front door, it creaked open slowly. Emily and James exchanged a look, and without hesitation, they entered. The house was quiet, an eerie calm before the storm. They moved silently, clearing each room with precision. But as they ascended the staircase to the second floor, they were met with an unexpected sight. Sarah, the quiet neighbor with the enigmatic past, stood before them, her hands trembling. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He made me do it." Emily's heart ached for Sarah, but she knew that getting the whole story was crucial. "Who made you do it, Sarah? Who is the Garden Strangler?" Sarah's trembling hand reached for a framed photograph on the hallway wall. She handed it to Emily. A picture of a man, seemingly ordinary, yet harboring a chilling darkness in his eyes. "My husband," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "He's the Garden Strangler. He threatened to kill me if I ever said anything. Please, you have to protect me." Emily and James exchanged grim looks. The stakes had just been raised yet again. They had caught Sarah, but the true mastermind behind the Garden Strangler's reign of terror was still at large, and he was closer than they could have ever imagined. As they arrested Sarah and escorted her from the house, the wind outside howled like an ominous omen. The serial killer's hideout had been unveiled, but the shadows of the past still loomed large, concealing the sinister truth behind the Garden Strangler's reign of terror. Emily knew that the battle was far from over, and she was determined to bring the true monster to justice, no matter the cost. Part 3. The arrest of Sarah had sent shockwaves through the suburban community. As news of her involvement with the Garden Strangler spread, neighbors whispered in hushed tones, questioning how they could have lived so close to such horror. Emily and James knew they had to act swiftly to capture Sarah's husband, the true mastermind behind the gruesome murders. With Sarah in custody, they pressed her for more information about her husband's whereabouts and his patterns. She provided them with what little she knew: his name, Robert, and the fact that he had meticulously planned each murder, always leaving just before the police arrived. It was clear that Robert was intelligent and cunning, making him all the more dangerous. The detectives worked around the clock, piecing together Robert's life. They discovered that he had a background in botany and had a fascination with exotic plants. This revelation sent shivers down Emily's spine as she realized the potential connection to the way the victims were displayed in gardens. Their investigation led them to a sprawling greenhouse on the outskirts of town that Robert had rented under an alias. Emily and James, accompanied by a SWAT team, approached the structure cautiously. It was a humid and claustrophobic place, filled with a bewildering variety of plants from all over the world. As they ventured deeper into the greenhouse, the air became heavy with tension. They could hear the sound of water dripping and leaves rustling, but there was no sign of Robert. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a small room hidden at the back of the greenhouse. Inside, they found a chilling collection of notebooks, each filled with meticulous notes on the Garden Strangler's victims and the specific plants associated with each murder. "It's like he was cataloging his trophies," James whispered, his voice tinged with disgust. Emily nodded in agreement, her gaze fixed on a map pinned to the wall. It was covered in markings and lines, indicating potential future targets. The detectives realized that Robert was planning to strike again, and soon. "We need to set up surveillance on these locations," Emily said, her determination unwavering. "We can't let him claim another victim." The hours turned into days as they waited for any sign of Robert. The tension among the task force was palpable, and the stakes had never been higher. Emily knew that they were running out of time, and the pressure was taking its toll on everyone. Then a break came. A surveillance team reported a sighting of Robert near one of the marked locations. Emily and James raced to the scene, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They found themselves in a dense forest, the trees casting long, ominous shadows. They moved silently through the woods, every step taking them closer to their quarry. And then, they saw him. Robert, standing beside a freshly dug grave, a look of sadistic pleasure on his face as he placed a small plant on top of it. "Freeze!" Emily shouted, her gun trained on Robert. "You're under arrest for the murders of those innocent women." Robert turned slowly, a wicked smile curling on his lips. "You're too late, Detective Foster. They've already become one with my garden." With shocking speed, he lunged at Emily, a knife gleaming in his hand. A struggle ensued, the forest echoing with the sounds of their desperate battle. James rushed to Emily's aid, but Robert was a formidable opponent, fueled by madness and desperation. As they fought for their lives, Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let Robert escape again. With one final surge of strength, she managed to disarm him, and James apprehended him with handcuffs. The Garden Strangler had been brought to justice, but the toll on Emily and James was immeasurable. As they stood in the dark forest, breathing heavily, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The relentless pursuit had come to an end, and the suburban community could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the victory came at a price. A gunshot rang out, shattering the silence of the forest. Emily's eyes widened in shock as she looked down at her partner, James, who had taken a bullet to protect her during the struggle with Robert. Blood seeped from his wound, staining the forest floor. Emily's heart sank as she desperately called for help over her radio. The forest seemed to close in around them, as she tried to stem the bleeding, but she knew that time was running out. The shadows that had haunted their investigation now threatened to claim the life of her partner. In the distance, the sirens of approaching police and paramedics grew louder, but they couldn't arrive soon enough. As James's breathing grew shallower, Emily held on to the hope that he would make it, but the darkness of the forest seemed to close in, casting a long and ominous shadow over their hard-fought victory.
Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like and comment down below and tell us what would you do in that situation.